Oh, hi everyone. We're live now. Thanks for making it out to the Exploring the Link Cannabis and Psychosis live stream. So today is a lived experience roundtable, and I'm surrounded by some amazing people who are here to share their stories. So I guess I'll leave it to them to introduce themselves. So I'll call on one, and then you call the next person out, okay? So I'll start off with myself, actually. My name is Elias. I've got lived experience with cannabis and psychosis, and my pronouns are he and him. So, Sarah, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. My name is Sarah. I also have lived experience with cannabis and psychosis, and my pronouns are she and her. It's great to be here. I'm going to call out Harrison.
Hey, Harrison here. Lived experience with cannabis and psychosis, as well as mental health, and I'm excited to be here. The pronouns are he and him.
And Heath, that leaves you.
I'll sneak in there.
Heath?
Yeah, my name is Heath. I use they, them pronouns. I, shocker, also have lived experience with mental health cannabis. I had a single incident of adolescent psychosis whenever I was 17, the summer between 11th and 12th grade. And I'll talk more about it, as we all will. But thanks for everyone for coming. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So, to everyone who's watching, this is the Ask the Expert series. So, we really want to answer any questions that you have. So, anything you want to ask us or anyone on the panel, just put that into the question box, the comment box, and there's also an anonymous form that you can fill out if you don't feel comfortable having your name associated with the question. And I guess we'll jump right into it. So we have, until we get some questions going on, we've got a couple ones stacked up. So we'll start off um, with just kind of a bit more of a boilerplate one. So this one's for everyone. Jump in when you can. So tell us a bit about your experience with cannabis and psychosis, and what was the mental and social context leading up to your episode. Anyone want to start us off with this?
I can go. Oh. Thank you. Yeah, so my first experience with cannabis was probably in high school, maybe like 10th, 11th grade. Classic story, friends, they got involved with it and I was curious. So I started experimenting with it as well. By the time I entered first year university, I was struggling pretty hard with depression and anxiety. So I've been seeing like a counselor on campus. And I definitely used cannabis as a way to, self-soothe, as a way to go to bed at night, a way to help me relax in social situations. I was always kind of like a nervous person. After I graduated, maybe like 1 or 2 years after I graduated, I got a job that had me working from home full time. So that meant I could smoke cannabis all day, every single minute of the day, which is what I did for about like a year and a half straight. And it just got to the point at the time I was living in like a little shoebox condo in Toronto. I was alone with just my cat. And I think that isolation kind of just really got to me, and the cannabis definitely exacerbated a lot of my anxiety. I started feeling very paranoid. I had feelings that I was being surveilled. I thought my friends were, talking to me only so they can gather information about me, and they would like reconvene in their own secret little group so they could have some sort of like, I don't know, a stack of evidence to show that I was like a bad person. And at the time, I had no idea that this was the first signs of a psychotic episode. I genuinely thought that I was like in a right state of mind, and that everybody was that I was tuning into something that that nobody else was aware of. And it escalated to the point, and I remember this very distinctly. It was like the week after my 26th birthday. I was actually supposed to be going on a trip to Europe with a friend. And the day before my flight was supposed to leave, that was kind of like when I hit my tipping point. I packed my bags and I was like, I cannot go on this flight tomorrow because the government knows and the police are after me. So I'm going to change my flight today. And I ended up taking a taxi all over the city. I actually at one point realized that what I was doing was a little foolish. So I asked the taxi driver to take me to the nearest hospital. And then I changed my mind as soon as I entered the doors. And I got into another taxi, drove all the way to the airport. And luckily, no one was able to change my flight on such short notice. And eventually my brother got in touch with me and he was able to pick me up. And then from there, they kind of, my family, they really don't have much experience with psychosis or any kind of mental health beyond like general depression, anxiety, but they knew that hospital would probably be the best place to take me. So that's where they took me, and I spent a bit of time there. And yeah, that was kind of my experience there.
Thanks, Sarah. I think there's a lot to that because it's kind of like the slow come up to it and like the difficulty in recognizing that something is happening, but then that slight awareness that like something was wrong, but the like having a hard time actually believing or knowing exactly what that is. Heath, I saw you're kind of
yes, the wheels were turning, and I was relating to some of the things that Sarah was saying, in particular that feeling of like tuning into something that you're like, oh, I know stuff that nobody else knows, that this is what it actually is now. Like that was very much what like my psychosis felt like, and it felt like realer than everything prior. It was like the most real things felt, but I think it was just how sensitive I was to all the stimuli around me, which made it feel so real, as well as the paranoid delusions about police in particular. That was one that, and I've read that is quite common, but yeah, the fear of police was like a real thing for me in my delusions as well, just feeling like the police were chasing me. I think that just kind of comes down to like feelings that people with mental illness have about like the role of police. I was actually at the height of my psychosis detained by police. Not good. I might talk more about that one a little later, but in terms of like the context leading up to it, I was 17. I had first had experiences of mental illness as early as I think like being 12 or 13 years old, with things like depression and what I would later come to understand as anxiety, but didn't realize that's what it was at the time. I was an OG emo kid before it was stylish. So, definitely got made fun of a lot for being depressed and self-harming. Great 7th grade, 8th grade experience there, and I think being like, neurodiverse and like a young queer person as well, just like really trying to find any way to fit in. And I actually kind of started to adopt that stoner, like cannabis using identity before I even started using cannabis, because I think I was just weird and eccentric. So people would, be like, oh yeah, like they're smoking weed for sure. And also because I was constantly crying, so my eyes were always red, but people would just be like, oh yeah, you're stoned. And I'd be like, yeah, I'm definitely just high and not crying all the time. Because I think it was easier. It was funnier for people, and it made people less like, averse to me, if I was just kind of like that fun stoner archetype. And then once I got into high school, I really leaned into that, and it became like a pretty big part of my identity. And I was smoking weed pretty regularly. I was like a daily cannabis user. And one of the common misconceptions I think that young people have about cannabis is that they really overestimate how much their peers are using cannabis. I was like, this is normal. Everyone smokes weed, right? Come on. But I was definitely using an excessive amount of cannabis. I was using it as a coping mechanism, and also as like a socialization tool, because it would be an excuse to make friends. People would come to me to like, oh, you have a bong or this or that. And it definitely was like a social like tool. Like it aided me, but also in the end had me surrounded by other people who smoked weed, to the point where that was like, that was all I was around. And then just prior, I was also out with friends a lot. I didn't have a lot of like structure to my life. It was during the summer. There was no school, and I was working, but once the pre-psychotic symptoms started to kick in, and I was just feeling weird, and people started to look kind of weird, and I was struggling to organize my thoughts as well as just my life, like finding socks in the laundry basket felt like a never ending. I was like, there are no socks in here, but there were. It's like everything was cycling through a junk drawer where you couldn't find anything. That's how everything kind of felt. And then yeah, I decided to cease cannabis use entirely and like stop cold turkey. And I was trying to like explain to my friends like, oh, I think I'm like having weed withdrawals, and they're like, that's not real. That's not what's happening. But yeah, and then it just got worse and worse until I was just terrified every day about the way that I felt, and I knew it wasn't normal. And I tried to self-admit to a psych ward, and they were not very helpful. They kind of just didn't know how to help me, but also the mental health services in my town at the time were very underfunded. And then I tried to call like a suicide hotline, and they were like not equipped to talk to someone experiencing psychosis, because I think it's a little bit different. So yeah, none of that really worked out until it really culminated, and then I ended up running away to I had a suicide attempt essentially, and then was detained by police during, and then brought in. So despite trying to self-admit the day before, it took a lot more to actually get services, which is also part of what's motivated me to get involved, because it's just young people shouldn't have to be at the end of their to get the help that they need. So that's a little bit about what led up to mine. So yeah.
Thanks, Eve. A lot of that actually resonated with me too, like the use of cannabis to be able to cope with like emotions, being able to use it as like a social tool, and like the actual like end result of like having those suicidal thoughts and actually like acting them, that leading to like ending up in hospital. And I think that's kind of a difficult story that a lot of people kind of go through, that it's hard to access those supports before getting to like that moment of like absolute crisis. And it's definitely something that I hope like systems level we can start to address at some point, right? And before we move on to Harrison, I just want to remind everyone that we're hoping to get all your questions in, so type anything you have into the comment box and we'll get right to it. Harrison, did you want to talk a bit about your social context and your experience with cannabis and psychosis?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks so much. So a bit of, I guess, it was summer going into grade 11. So similarly to the other two who had spoke, it happened in high school, or at least the cannabis use was going on throughout high school, as I'm kind of realizing like I might fit into some box of like struggling with anxiety or depression. So it's kind of a difficult summer going into grade 11. I just finished grade 11 functions for the second time. Wasn't enjoying that, but it was, for that reason, it was a tough summer. It wasn't very social. I was away from all my friends. I didn't have much of a support community. I was working at when the course finished, I ended up working at a kitchen, which I just find, in my personal experience, having worked at a few kitchens, you can run into an environment that cannot be that at times, I'm trying to be careful with my words here, that at times isn't always the most encouraging or positive, can be competitive in there and stuff like that. So either way, that's a bit of the social context leading up to the episode, so to speak. And then the emotional or mental context leading up to it was probably, I was, that due to all those kind of social factors, I felt definitely low I'd say the lowest of the depressions I had felt, and so even verging on suicidal for sure. But yeah, cannabis had kind of, with all this disruption in my life generally, I just felt like cannabis was just soothing, taking the edge off of a lot of those very difficult feelings and emotions. And so I kind of just kept telling myself, like once I get back home, things are going to be okay. I'll be around friends. I'll be going back to school. I'll be like in an environment where I know people, and like it's not just going to work when I wake up at noon and working the closing shift until they close. Like it's there's more to life than that. And so I just was holding off until getting home. But unfortunately, when I got home, the depression didn't kick as easy as I thought it would. And it kind of lingered around. So what I ended up what I ended up doing was seeking out treatment with a psychiatrist, and they were great, very helpful with the talk therapy and helping me communicate my thoughts and emotions and ideas. But I was pretty adamant personally about being put on antidepressants, and they gave me some pushback. But over time, we kind of decided together is the right thing to do. And when I took the antidepressants, they gave me a spike and actually threw me into a bit of mania or psychosis. So along with the cannabis, just the combination was what I'm calling the perfect storm of things in my life. That the cannabis, the SSRIs, the being away from friends, not knowing where I fit in socially, all these things kind of came together, and just the cannabis like kind of confused my perspective of where I actually thought I was, and it just kept me from living life presently because it kind of blurred that whole. I felt like it blurred some things. I wouldn't say it was responsible, but definitely was a big factor and blurred the lines between what is okay feelings and what is like this is serious and we should try and get rid of this and be really proactive about how we overcome it. So
Thank you. I think you touched on a lot of really important things there, like the social isolation piece, like the not having a support network behind you, being able to have like manage a bunch of stressors at work, and all of these things compounded by like the cannabis kind of making it a bit hazy, and that's something I can relate to as well. Like just using pot, not really knowing like what was real necessarily, like what was something of concern, and what did I actually need to pay attention to, and what was just like from the pot.
totally.
Yeah. So we got our first question in. So from Kira. So what's your reaction when folks talk about psychosis as the worst thing that can happen to you if you smoke lots of weed? Is it accurate, stigmatizing, effective, all the above? Anyone want to take this on? Pete? Yep.
I could say something. I could say something about that one because I think that the I don't know, like the way education approached like leveraging mental illness as this like fear mongering thing in drug education was extremely harmful and not good because I think it really like perpetuated a lot of the internalized stigma that I had about what was happening. I was like, this is all my fault. I'm guilty. Like I ruined my brain. Like that's not productive to have young people feeling that way. And specifically to answer Kira's question, in a weird way, I do feel like it's accurate. Like psychosis is for me the worst thing I've experienced. Like it was terrifying. Is it accurate? Or is it stigmatizing? Yes, also definitely. But I think that could change. I think that the way we talk about psychosis could be different. And is it effective? Also, no. I would say because I think the education I received didn't really get into the nuance of what psychosis is. They just said, "Oh, cannabis will cause schizophrenia," and that was another thing. Once I had psychosis, I was like, "Oh, I'm schizophrenic now. This is forever." It causes early onset. Now it's over for me. This is how I'm going to feel forever. Because they didn't say like, oh, it can cause like an episode of like episodic psychosis. Like they don't talk about like the spectrum of cannabis use. It's either like, oh, you use cannabis. It's not like if you use cannabis every day versus if you use cannabis every once in a while. So yeah, is it accurate? Sure. Is it stigmatizing? Definitely. And is it effective? No. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of things that we're trying to correct with the Exploring the Link project, right? Like being able to get the right information out there about cannabis and psychosis. And I think talking about the stigmatizing fact and the idea that like people get blamed when they've used cannabis and maybe have an episode of psychosis, like it's huge because that I know in my case, like I didn't know how to process that, and then it can act like a barrier to actually engaging because then you have to go through this whole other step of like all these levels of self blame. Did anyone else have something they wanted to add into that?
I was just gonna say, piggyback on that. Is it the worst thing? Like, it's pretty bad. Like, it's definitely not like permanent, like schizophrenia in that sense. But when people, I think a lot of what's overlooked, like in mental health generally, is this recovery concept. It's like it's very polarized. It's like you're okay or you're not, right? Like but recovery is this constant position you can be battling through, you know, like the way I talk about my recovery from the episodes, like I'm still in the process of recovering from 6 years ago, and my confidence was completely shot from being in the hospital and being around people who I couldn't have a coherent conversation with, and I wasn't even communicating clearly. So yeah, it was pretty bad. And like recovery is different for all people. I'm going to say that out the gates, but you know, the concept that I felt like it took at least 5 years to get my confidence, or 4 years to get my confidence to where it was, and only now can I say like I really have worked. I can look back on all this and say I'm taking lessons from it, but it's 6 years later being able to say, yeah, I learned something from it for the first time, that's a lot of damage, you know, so to speak. So
Yeah, thank you. And I love that you introduced the idea of recovery too, because so often people just run up against the medical model where it's like you have this illness and you're kind of done for life. And I know even like the stigma around schizophrenia that it's like once you get it, like you're done. Like there's nothing you can do. Like the recovery model kind of pushes back against that and like puts forward the idea that you can actually there is recovery. Like you can move forward from this, you can go in a direction. It might not always be linear, you might have some missteps or like fall back a couple steps or kind of go in the wrong direction at first. But there is always that chance for progress, which I think is really important when we're talking about cannabis and psychosis and mental illness and everything in general. Like that idea of being able to move forward and to strive for something more is really important.
Mm-hmm. And if I could, oh, am I muted? No, okay. And yeah, essentially it's just this thing where like, it's important to talk about, like we need to talk about it, but the way we're talking about it now, it hasn't up until now been very productive. Like don't weaponize my mental illness against me, like telling me that cannabis causes mental illness. I'm like a mentally ill person already. So I'm like, okay, well, that's not productive for me. Like we need to have a more like harm reduction focused and a more anti-stigmatizing like focus in the way we talk about it, because also none of my friends knew how to handle it and they were all freaked out because they're like, whoa, like this is terrifying. And I'm like, yeah, yes it is. And if education had gone differently, I think my experience would have been a lot easier.
Yeah, I do think it is a danger that people weaponize like mental illness because like going back to the idea of like blaming people for their own mental illness or what have you, like the idea that it's like a character fault or something. And that's been around for so long that it's hard to push back against. But I think what we're trying to do is like I guess all of us right here on top of everyone else in the recovery movement is to try and push back against that and be like there are things that can affect it. There are things that affect recovery that affect like your health and all these things. But like you can't blame someone for this because like how would you know? There's no like way to know before you have your first joint or before you enter into life. Like okay, like you're going to experience this and this. Like we have to be able to accept that there is like a random nature to it as well, and like being able to move forward from where we're at to somewhere better. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add in there before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I loved what both Harrison and Heath were saying about stigma. For me, I mean, there's definitely the aspect of weaponizing mental health. For me, my experience, I'm jumping back, but with like Kira's question where you asked what's your reaction when folks talk about psychosis is like the worst thing that could happen to you. And yeah, it's true. Like my episode, the hospitalization was pretty terrible and really, really scary. But coming out of the hospital and having to like find a way to reintegrate back into my social circles sometimes felt even worse. For me, like I'm lucky, like none of my friends were like blamed me per se. But there was definitely this sort of like invisible wall that they kind of put up where, you know, if I ever strayed or if they ever like strayed near a topic of conversation that even maybe could like have a little hint of like mental health attached to it, they're just like, oh no, like let's not talk about it. Or like if I wanted to bring something up, I would somehow feel a little awkward because I would feel like, you know, they weren't really ready to like listen to any of it. So in that sense, it was also very like isolating. That definitely plays into the whole stigmatization of mental health, and also that in conjunction with drug use of any kind or any substance.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that that idea of like stigmatization, even by people who mean well and who like are there to support us, is really, really important because not everyone is going to know the right thing to say right off the bat. And I think that moves us really well to the next question in here, which is from Anne. So, what would be a helpful thing to say to someone experiencing psychosis when there are stories in the news about a person with mental health committing a horrible crime? And I'm sure we've all come up against this because there's like the media likes to report on kind of like the worst sides of mental health and mental illness. So what would you all think would be something that would be helpful that someone could say to you in a time like that when something like that's going on in the world?
I have a lot that I could say about it, only because I'm going to try and bite my tongue. But the criminalization of people with mental illness is like something I'm very passionate about. Because media depictions of people with mental illness, whether it's the news, whether it's movies, like they do make people with mental illness seem scary. And I think a lot of the interventions you see with like, people dying in wellness checks in Canada right now, you call for a wellness check and people are dying, and that shouldn't be the result. But I think it's the motives that like you're trying to protect everyone else from the person with mental illness rather than like actually trying to protect the person with mental illness. And frankly, like a lot of the systems aren't built for us. Like that's kind of how I feel about it. And what I would say is, I don't know, I would probably just say that like it's the community is here for you more than, more than the news and the media, more than the police, more than the systems. It's like, it's the community, and like, they should just make friends that have like all the people, like we're having this conversation right now. Like this is more beneficial than like, I don't know, than like a lot of other things. But I think that's what I'll say for now. And then
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said for that, like contact-based education and being able to like have these conversations with the people in your life too, like being able to ask someone like, what would you want to hear when something like that's going on? And I see the decriminalized mental health sign you got in the background there, and it's an important thing because like some people become unwell, and that doesn't represent everyone. That doesn't represent like even everyone with the same illness, but like it's hard because we just have the police to interact with them in that time. And most of the time, there aren't like social workers or community health workers who can go out and support people in that time.
in general, people experiencing psychosis pose a larger threat to themselves than to the people around them. Like this is also just the case. But that's not so much for the person. That's for everyone else responding to that person's situation.
Very important point. Sarah Harrison, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
I think he made a really great point about people who are suffering from episodes or have a history, like they are at a greater risk of harming themselves than others. Speaking from my own personal experience when I was going through my episode, and like leading up to it, I wish my friend, and they meant well, my family, they all meant well. No one had any idea, including myself, of what was happening. But looking back, I wish someone had been there to, kind of sit me down, validate my feelings. Even though they were completely unfounded, it would have been nice to have someone be like, hey, you know what you're going through, it seems very scary. I've been scared myself. I may not know exactly what's going through your head right now, but we can sit together and you can talk it out. And like, because during my episode, and I think for many people who go through these episodes, like there is a certain logic that you're following. Like you're not just running amok and like you see in the movies where people just go just do whatever they want. There was a certain logic that I was following. It was misplaced logic, but I didn't have an agenda of wanting to hurt anybody. And also, Heath, you mentioned, and Elias as well, police often being that kind of first line of intervention. And a common theme in people who have these episodes is this like this already ingrained fear of some kind of police or government like entity coming after you. So seeing that, like actually having to experience that, even if they're just there to de-escalate the situation, like that just kind of amplifies everything. So yeah, I think for me, it would just be a matter of, validating a person's feelings. Fear, I think, is the number one thing that people are experiencing when they're having these episodes. And yeah.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point because is being able to see the person going through these things as human, right? Like being able to see all of us as human, being able to recognize that like we all have emotions and that your emotions might be raised during this state, but like it is scary, it is tough, it is like it is all these things, and being able to have someone sit with you and like sit with those emotions and help you kind of like work through them is so important. Harrison, did you have anything you wanted to add in there?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of good things have been. You guys have all said some great points already, but just like one kind of thing that comes to mind, if like this is if the person is like concerned of like where they could go, like where this could take them. You know, the person who's asking, I assume, would be consoling someone who's like seeing this media play out and be like, is this like what I'm gonna have to deal with? And like the way I see it is like, yeah, like I think mental health is such a recovery focused thing. Like you're constantly in that state of like trying to recover. If you're not recovering, you're kind of just sitting in where you are. You always want to be moving towards being better than where you were yesterday. And I think the scary part about psychosis to me is that complete lack of control or like the seeming lack of control over your thoughts and where your emotions are driving you. But the truth is like you have to see it as there's an issue there, but we can address the issue and work towards being better. But there's no problem with having an issue. It's having an issue that's untreated that's worse than anything. Saying I have psychosis is not a bad thing. It's saying here's where we are and here's where we can move from. But if you're like, I don't know what's up, like something's up, that's also a step. But you know, it's not you have to it's helpful to be able, I say in mental health, it's like just as helpful to be able to label things as it is unhelpful, because you know, every once in a while diagnoses like and stuff like that get us self-stigmatizing, but at the end of the day it's helpful at times to say a spade is a spade, like this is what I'm dealing with. And there's like history of people who've dealt with this stuff for years, and it's like, you know, for the most part, like true good news on like how you can take care of yourself better. So you know, there's good media out there that, you know, media likes to focus on a story and make a story out of something that, you know, will grab people's attention. And, you know, it's unfortunate that it works that way, but, you know, people want a story, and it's unfortunate that we have to feed them, or people are getting fed this, but we got to work on changing the narrative.
I think you brought up a bunch of important points there, and something that really resonated with me was the idea that like a diagnosis can actually be helpful because you have like an explanation for what happened and then like a plan going forward. And the idea that like other people have gone through this and recovered and gotten to a better place and taken into their mindset like the striving for something better. And I know that's something that helped me out incredibly, like being able to have like a reason for why all this was happening and a plan of action going forward. So we've got one question directed specifically for Heath. So it's an anonymous question. So when you tried to access care at the psychiatry emergency department, did they provide you any kind of support at all? And why did they deny you?
This is a question I ask myself as far as like why they denied me. But I think it's likely maybe because of underfunding and the nature of the psychiatric ward in my hometown. They had recently built a new hospital, like this really nice hospital, but the psych ward was still operating out of like the abandoned hospital, like that people thought was like shut down and condemned, but I guess the psych ward was still operating in it. It was not. It was in very poor shape. Seeing it was, you know, on the inside, it was very like disheartening to see that this is like the care that some of our most vulnerable community members receive. But it was also an adult psych ward, so maybe whenever I presented to the psych ward saying, "Hey, like I am scared to be alive right now. Life is terrifying. I don't know what's going on." They might just have not really known. It might have just been the individual that I talked to. But definitely a huge mental health failing there. And I think I had also met with a crisis team, but because of the discombobulated thought patterns I was having, it's hard to place like when that happened. But I believe I also met with my parents brought me to meet with like a crisis team, and they kind of did an evaluation and talked to me, but I was also very coherent still and able to like articulate my experience quite well. So I think they almost took me less seriously. And then they were like, all right, well, we'll see what happens. And then they also just like turned me away. Like, I don't think any of them really realized the severity of the situation. And also if you present saying like, I'm going to kill myself, they're kind of like, okay, but do you have a plan? And I mean, like, I didn't have a plan. I couldn't brush my hair. Like, no, I don't have a plan, but I'm going to try and do it. So I think that also might've played into it. I think just even people working in the field having not enough access to information about like, you know, more niche mental illness, I guess. I'm not sure. But yeah, they tried to support me a little bit, but they didn't really do a good job. And then, yeah, it wasn't until the police detained me that they were like, all right, well, now you're going. It's like, when you wanted to go, you couldn't go, but now we're bringing you. So, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that brings up an incredibly important point that like people are getting turned away at the emergency room, and like whatever the process it is to like get people in, like it's not serving anyone, or I shouldn't say anyone, it's not serving everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so like there was obviously a failing there, and hopefully that will change over time, and there can be some sort of recognition of the risk in a situation like that, because I wouldn't wish anyone to go through that.
No.
So the next question we have is a bit more focused on after the episode of psychosis. So what does the recovery process look like for each of you individually? Do you feel comfortable with the process? What helps you most in recovery?
If I could just speak quickly, like I think a big piece of my answer is actually going to be like restating the question, and specifically like for each of you personally, because yeah, like it is so personal. Like I don't have like all my friends who've experienced like any form of mental health, like if I look at any of them like in the weeks following what's happened to them, like none of what they're doing to feel themselves again is going to be the same. Like everyone is going to need something different, and there's no one stop shop / solution for everyone. Like it's about doing what you need to do to feel at your best. And I think a big part of recovery is becoming aware of what the things are you need to feel at your best. And like I think that was the biggest part of my recovery, hands down, was getting to a point where I just like I broke through a wall where I was like having trouble, like not having trouble, but once I broke through this wall, I just felt like 10 times more self-aware. I was like, wow, like the mental clarity that I'm experiencing right now is like nothing I've experienced like since this has happened to me. And so it just, that came from just leaning into, it was more recent. So due to this whole COVID thing, like I was forced away from a lot of communities, like my supportive communities that I know and love and that keep me happy and well, like no problem with that. It's just funny that it happened out of like so much discomfort. I found this, all the things that are good for me is because I was forced away from this. I think when you have a supportive community, like even if things aren't great, they can feel a bit better because you're being supported. It's like, that's great. The greatest part about it, right, is the support that comes from it. But I found when, I separated myself from all the people, and like, I would like not only would be supported by them, but I'd hang out with them, all this stuff. And so when I just had so much time to myself, I had to really reevaluate, okay, how am I spending all the hours of my day? I just wanted to like think about what I'm doing. And because the pandemic and quarantine, self-isolation, stuff like that, like I wasn't going out much, I just kind of like planned out my day a lot more, filled it with things that bring me joy in life, such as like fitness, sleeping well, spending time in nature, stuff like that. And honestly, like the return on that investment of just finding out, or like personally asking myself, what brings you joy? Like what what makes you feel the most alive, I think, is the best thing to ask. Because if you just fill your life with the things that make you feel the most alive, that's a life well spent, in my opinion. So
Thank you. I think that brings up the point that like the recovery process is different for everyone, and the idea that if you fill up your life with the things that bring you joy and the things that like energize you and give you some sort of purpose, like that it'll be a better life. And that process of like reconnecting to that and figuring out what that is for you, and like taking that extra step of like actually implementing it into your life, it's a huge thing. Thank you.
sorry, you just kind of closed the loop perfectly there. But like, just when you mentioned that, like finding those things that, sorry, I just lost it. Never mind. It's gone.
Sorry, we can always come back to you too.
Cool.
Sarah or Heath, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I could just speak to my experience, just like in some of the specifics, which were, going into the psych ward, I was put on medications because part of the way my psychosis manifested was just like so many thoughts happening, like big floods. Like it felt like my inner monologue was actually like 8 radios playing at different speed. It was a mess. So they put me on a lot of like thought suppressing antipsychotic medication. So that was definitely an adjustment, and I would try and like read while I was in the psych ward, but the medication just made it hard for me to retain anything. So then I was like, dang, I can't read anymore. Huge bummer. And then also just like reintegrating back into society, like outside of the psych ward, because it's hard to reintegrate. Like, well, it's not hard, but it's like there are challenges associated with it, especially like going back into school. And then like still being on antipsychotics and having to like write an essay about like Hamlet, which is also just like a lot of like the theme of grade 12 English was like psychotic people. And I was like, okay, great. But luckily my English teacher was super supportive and like she knew everything that was going on. Like many a baby gay, the English teachers were a solace that were just super understanding. And I think she had her own experiences with mental illness. So that was really beneficial. But I think another way that I tried to cope with what happened was just kind of separating myself and being like, what if this had happened to someone else? Like, I wouldn't blame like any other 17-year-old that was in this terrible situation. I would be upset that it happened to them. And I'd look at all the ways that like drug policies and drug education and the mental health care system failed them and what needs to change. And then I channeled a lot of that into advocacy. I got involved volunteering with like Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Now sit on a number of like committees representing young people with lived experience. And that's been a really great way for me to cope with it because I've been able to channel it into something really productive and something that I think makes me feel good about having had the experience and being able to share it with others. And yeah, reduce stigma and just kind of like, have conversations. So it's been good. Yeah. Oh, and another thing was too that I was on medication, but also met with a psychiatrist and was also in therapy that was like addictions therapy. I met with like an addictions therapist that used mindfulness techniques, which as like, like a 17-year-old weed smoking hippie, I was like, oh, mindfulness. Like we were talking about meditation and using that to like manage my cannabis use. And it was really helpful. It was like tailored to me. It was like, well, what do you want? Like, I'm not going to tell you to stop. Do you want to reduce your use? And yeah. And obviously it's like telling my friends that I was seeing like a cannabis addictions therapist. They're like, you're addicted to weed? Like, week, and I'm like, well, it happens. What can I say? But yeah, that's kind of how I dealt with it.
Yeah, and I think you bring up so many things that are vital to recovery, like the idea of seeing someone and addressing substance use and addictions and being able to do that concurrently with getting support for mental health as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like an arbitrary distinction between the two, but like being able to do it both at the same time, I know helped me a lot. And having one and not the other kind of left me at a disadvantage. And one other thing that you mentioned that I really wanted to touch on before I move on to Sarah was the idea that it is hard after an episode of psychosis to like concentrate, to find out your new normal on the pills, to like live this new life after like all these things happen. And I know after my episode of psychosis, I couldn't concentrate in the same way that I could before, so I had to reteach myself to do all of that. It's tough and it's an adjustment, but everyone needs to find their own ways to do things. And things like therapy, reconnecting to nature, reconnecting to the community, finding your advocacy voice, and whatever it may be that brings you that joy and that purpose is really important. Sarah, did you want to add something in?
Yeah, sure. This is an interesting question because I think I'm still trying to figure that out. My episode, I'm 28 now, so my episode was 2 years ago. So it's only been maybe in the last year where I've become even comfortable like mentioning it, even to my friends. Even I had a couple of friends who like drove me to the hospital. It only got to that point that I could even mention it to those people who saw me at like my lowest. But I think in the last couple of months, like comedies is a big coping thing for me, and I've become more comfortable like joking about it. I know it doesn't work for everybody, and psychosis, mental health in general, cannabis use, like it's not like something that you can just joke lightly about. But for me personally, with my own personal experience, I've always used comedy as a way to, kind of help me in social situations, making myself feel a bit more comfortable. So I think that is something that's been really powerful. But yeah, in terms of being fully at peace with my experience, I mean, the hospital I was admitted to is like minutes away from my house, and every time I go home to visit my family, like I still kind of avert my eyes when I pass by it. Not that I was mistreated or anything, but there's just still a lot of like internalized stigma, a lot of shame that I'm still working through. So I'll TBD.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think that brings up the point that it can take a while to enter into that like full-fledged recovery, to find out what works and to find out how to move forward. And the fact that it's different for every person means that every person has like a different timeline attached to it. So some people might kind of have their episode and right away know what they need to do, and some people will take a lot longer. I know it took me like a full year just to even process what had happened, to like understand that I'd gone through an episode of psychosis and accept that. So the idea that like being able to work in your own time is really important. And personally, I love comedy too. Being able to laugh at something, I find takes away a lot of the power it has over me. Um, so the next question we have uh, is, I think, a really important one. And it's, is psychosis different for different people? I mean, what they experience with it, or is there a common thread? Because I think all of us can speak. All of us can speak a bit to what our psychoses were like, and I imagine like we all have maybe some common elements, but there's definitely probably some variation among us. Does anyone want to start us off with that?
I can say that I think it likely is different for different people because it's an experience that's being manifested via your brain, which is, molded by your experiences, like your fears, which is part of, I think, like the delusions that you have are kind of tailored to your lived experience thus far. So, which is, your brain is a handy, sneaky thing where it's like, oh, your like worst fears. Yeah, let's just channel all of that into like hallucinations and delusions and that type of thing. So it's like a custom built terror experience. It's great. Do not recommend. But then I do think that there are common threads, like the paranoia of like, judgment from your peers. Like, what are they saying about you? Thinking people are talking about you. I thought everyone knew what was happening to me, even though nobody really knew. And something I mentioned earlier, the threat of like fear of the police. Like that's a super common delusion for people with psychosis because it's scary, the idea of being detained by police and what they'll do to you. And I think that all just, comes from like pretty tangible, like there's reasons for that. So while it is different, I do think that there are definitely common threads with all of that. And then just navigating that like internalized stigma and then like the stigma from your peers and then the larger social stigma as well. Just like that, there's nobody for whom I think like stigma is absolved in their psychosis. Like it's always prevalent, I would say.
Thank you. I love the way you put that. It's like a personal terror experience because it's like all the things that are going on in your brain just kind of like amplified and turned into something like scary most of the time. Sarah, Harrison, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I read something really interesting a while ago about schizophrenia and how the voices that one hears they manifest differently depending on like your cultural upbringing. I read that people in North America they tend to hear more like aggressive, angry voices versus those in other countries. That I don't know if that's absolutely true, but what I will say is I think definitely like um, your social upbringing, kind of what your preconceived notions of those things definitely play a role um, in how those mental health conditions may affect you personally. Um, and I think for me, when it came to learning about psychosis, like those common threads and those stories that I resonated with, they were a source of comfort for me. Because when I was in the thick of it, I was convinced that I'm the only person in the entire world who has ever experienced this. And for sure, many of my experiences may have been unique, but knowing that um, no, yeah, knowing that I wasn't alone in some of those feelings was definitely very comforting.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think I know the article you're referencing there with the like North America having harsher voices and then more I think it was more collectivist countries having like more soothing voices. And I think that brings up a really important thing is that like there are these common threads like in that like hearing voices would be a common thread there. But how people experience it, what like the actual content is, what how it manifests and how it affects people will all be different.
And something that I'd add too, just because like there is the commonality of like hearing voices, but there are different types of hallucinations. Like I feel like it's like, hallucinations and delusions are pretty common, but then the actual like deep down of what those are and mean to people is what differs. And for me, I was having visual hallucinations, which is actually much less common from what the doctors have told me and from what I've read. But yeah, like people's faces looking very warped and seeing movement and things that weren't there. So for me, it was a lot more visual hallucination. So I think that's one way that they can differ from people as well.
And for the people watching who want to delve a bit deeper into maybe like the anatomy, there's a group called Epion, the Early Psychosis Ontario network, who has really good infographics about like the anatomy of psychosis and kind of what it looks like and a bunch of really helpful tools. And before we move on to the next question, Harrison, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, not much. I feel like you guys killed it. But Heath, just to point out how different like it gets. Like Heath mentioned, like it's not the most usual, but they had more of the like visual hallucination stuff. I've never experienced in my life anything visual, but I have experienced a lot of like delusional thinking. On the other hand, right? So I feel like if you talk about psychosis, like here are all the things that are possible, but like you might only experience like four of them together, or like five different ones, or it manifests differently. But when you read the description in the DSM or wherever you're like reading up about psychosis, like it'll give you everything that's possible. And I think DSM, the way they go through even categorizing mental health stuff these days is like it has to have at least four of this criteria and then something of this. But like there's like 20 from that list, right? So you can pick four of any of these and then like down. So I'm just pointing out there are many ways you can mix and match the symptoms and how you can identify psychosis manifesting.
This is something that actually the first time I heard it referred to as such was from Elias, which was that like psychosis isn't just like this one like solid thing. It's like a collection of symptoms that varies, and it's like it's not just like something you can pinpoint super, indefinitely. But.
And I think that's such an important point because, like, the fact that there may be common threads, but everyone does have different experiences with it, and that it is kind of a laundry list of things that different people might have different things on that list, as well as like how those things manifest and how it affects them. Awesome. So we're coming up close to the hour here, but I think we have time for one more question at the very least. And this one's from Victoria, who's a youth worker and wants to find some creative ways to educate youth and have informative conversations with them about cannabis and drug use. She's wondering if you're able to share some resources or point them in the right direction. Anyone have any quick resources that they know of? And I'm going to do a quick plug for cannabispsychosis.ca because I think there's some good stuff on there.
I'll plug Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policies, Sensible Cannabis Education Toolkit, which you can get on the CSSTP website. And it's just like a resource that was made by youth for adults, actually, by youth for more so the people that educate young people or are engaging with young people about their cannabis use. And it has like, it breaks it down into like, 10 harm reduction principles, like really emphasizing the spectrum of cannabis use and people's specific risk factors, methods of consuming cannabis, and gets into a lot of the nitty gritty, but in a way that's super non-stigmatizing and can definitely be tailored to young people because it's made by other young people. So that's one that I will plug.
Awesome. Thanks, Eve. Sarah Harrison, do you have any ones that you want to share? No? Okay, I'll plug one more then. So Epion again, they have a My Cannabis IQ package for both clinicians and for the people going through it. And they actually have like kind of a flow chart of like what the conversation could look like if someone is thinking about using cannabis, is using cannabis, like harm reduction tips to be able to talk about. And then obviously the lower risk cannabis use guidelines are pretty important too.
Another one that I've used personally it's like the eToke tool. It's like a cannabis like self-monitoring test just to like reflect on and evaluate your relationship with cannabis. I accessed it through the Umbrella Project, which is Algonquin College's like harm reduction service on campus, which is awesome that they have that, but it's a good one too. Just like super neutral, just like how much do you smoke weed? Why? How come? Just like exploratory questions, really good stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Eve. So we might be able to squeeze one more quick one in. So this one is from Anne. So what helped each of you gain insight into your illness?
If I can chime in quickly, what ultimately helped me find the most insight was forcing myself to be still and like do a bit of what I was reflecting on earlier in the live stream about really thinking in about what brings me joy in life. But I really did have to find the place of stillness and get over my resentment for like the actual events of what happened. Like I was, to be honest, I was like pretty angry. Like I was like, I can't believe, like I was beating myself up about it. I was hard on myself. I was like, I was like, what does this mean for the rest of my life? All this stuff. But once I finally kind of like let the dust settle on that, recover, let my confidence build up again, I stopped and I was like, what really makes me happy in life? Like, I think mental illness generally is such a thing that can rob us of like the things we love most in life, that ultimately I think it's one of the more important questions we can ask ourselves when dealing with recovery, like moving past that illness, is what do I love so much? Like what's going to keep me grounded when, my like the voice in my head is telling me like, you're not needed here. Like what makes me feel needed on earth? And ultimately I think connecting with that is what made me feel a sense of purpose again, and like a sense of, like wake up in the morning, what are my things I'm going to do? And yeah, I think what gave me the most insight into my illness was forcing myself to be still, or being put into a position where I would be still and like could reflect really intentionally on my life and what had happened without any form of resentment or negative energy associated with the reflection process.
Thank you. I think that stillness is really a tough thing to find, but it can be so beneficial. Heath or Sarah, any thoughts?
Yeah, for me, it was seeking out peer support online mostly, because again, in my day-to-day life, I'm still a little hesitant to talk about it. But Reddit, as much as it can be kind of cesspool, there are some really great subreddits where people are just kind of sharing their stories. asking questions like, hey, I'm going through this. Like, has anyone gone through this? And overall, just a really validating experience. I remember, while I was in the hospital, just coming out of the hospital, when I was in therapy, I'd be giving all these resources, and a lot of it just felt like very kind of like sanitized clinical breakdown of these conditions, and it just felt very impersonal, and it felt like I was some sort of like lab rat or some sort of statistic, and just kind of reading it, I'm like, okay, like I'm educating myself, but I don't feel any personal connection to it. Like I'm still trying to kind of put that barrier between me and whatever I was seeing on page. And yeah, Facebook too. There's some groups where people from all over the world will come together and talk about side effects of medication, and just kind of like things that a textbook or a book written by some PhD or whomever would necessarily touch on. So if anyone's in a position where they're unsure of like where they can find insight that feels personal to them, I highly encourage just kind of reaching out online, honestly. Yeah, there's a lot of really legitimate stuff out there. It's really, really helpful.
Thanks, Sarah. I think online communities can be such huge tools for people, and it really can bring together a bunch of people with like similar lived experiences so that they can share their wisdom, which is always a good thing. Heath, do you want to end us off with this?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think I kind of touched on earlier when I was talking about like I don't know how I dealt with it, which was like I kind of removed myself from it. And I mean, that was part of my psychosis, was feeling like there was no person. There wasn't an identity there. And it was like really this weird thing, but then kind of trying to approach it like, oh, what if this had happened to someone else? Because I have like a track record of low self-esteem, and I'm very compassionate. But when it comes to myself, I'm like my worst critic. So obviously, just echoing what both Sarah and Harrison have said, it's like, it's this thing where like you can beat yourself up about it, and you blame yourself, and you internalize all of this stigma. But then I kind of tried to just externalize my experience as a I don't know, maybe as a way to cope, but also just to find empowerment through the experience, if you will, like externalizing it and looking at like, okay, well, like what led to this? Like what are the policy things that like went wrong? Like how could this have gone differently? And how can I prevent this from happening to anybody else? Because I wouldn't wish this experience on like my worst enemy. Like this was terrifying, terrible. And just kind of looking at that. And then another component of my psychosis was like lack of direction and not knowing, because going into grade 12, it's like, oh, you have to decide what to do with your whole life. And I was like very conflicted because of like deeply rooted identity issues that I had. And then just being like, all right, well, let's see where this goes. And just kind of trying to, I don't know, read about it. I got super into drug policy. And for the past like 6 years, it's just, I've been learning more about policy around substances, but also broadening that out into like mental health broadly, and looking at the systemic factors that play into people's vulnerability to experience not only psychosis or mental illness, but like, criminalization for it, or violence from it, or houselessness as well. Being in the psych ward, I saw so many people where I was like, oh, these are just like the homeless folk that I've seen around town. And it made me aware of so much larger like social issues that like, and how connected they all are as well. Like this, like, intersectional type of approach to it. And that's been a lot of, I guess, how I've gained insight into it, is just, I mean, obviously I speak very much about like my personal experience, but I do it in a way that I think is like, I'm kind of removing myself from it. Which makes it easy for me to talk about, because I don't have to worry about like if people are judging me. I really don't care. It's like, that's the whole reason I'm talking about it, is so that you stop judging people with mental illness and like reflect on why you're doing that. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Heath. I think that contact-based education is huge. Like being able to learn from people who have gone through it, and to be able to share those experiences, and to be able to have like that understanding that like you're not alone in this, and no one who goes through this is alone, and we all have our networks to tap into, that other people have gone through it. We're all making our way through, and that we're working towards that better recovery. And I'm mindful we're going a bit over time. I want to give everyone 30 seconds to have like one final thought though, and I'll let Heath start us off.
Yeah. I guess all I'll say is that, if someone in your life is experiencing mental illness, maybe don't tell them that it's all in their head, because it is, and that's the problem. That's how mental illness works, and it's not productive. So, be compassionate, be supportive, listen. Sometimes it's better to listen than talk. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for everyone for coming, and we hope we shed some light on your questions and curiosities, and maybe dispelled some misconceptions about psychosis and substance use.
Thanks, Heath. Sarah, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I'm so glad we have panels like these around where people can talk about their lived experience. I think they're incredibly helpful, and we could save a life, could help a person gain more insight. If you're a young person who is currently using a lot of cannabis, more power to you, but don't underestimate the effects that it can have. And yeah, it's all about education and awareness, and that's it.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. And Harrison, do you want to close us off?
Sure. Yeah. Just like if I could say anything, I'd like to speak to myself like 6 years ago and just say like, man, I know you're super salty and like torn to pieces by the fact that you just feel like you lost your brain, you lost your confidence, you lost like who you know yourself to be. But you'll get all that back and more if you just stick to what you know is right and commit to, living well, stick to what brings you joy and, treat yourself well, don't be too hard on yourself. It's just life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Harrison. And thank you to all of our panelists for coming out and talking to everyone for over an hour now. And thank you for everyone who watched. If you enjoyed this, give us a like, give us a follow on socials. I think they're all posted in the chat. And there's also a forum to evaluate us, so to speak, if you're interested, so we can know if this is helpful, what we can change, and just to get your feedback on all of this. So once again, thank you for everyone who came out, panelists, viewers, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. All right.